We talked a couple of weeks ago, post-Parkland shooting, about the reflexive Republican, read NRA, response that mass shootings are a mental health issue. I hope that one day we'll be able to put that talking point to rest, and if we do, our next guest will have played a prominent role. We called him back today to talk more about guns, and this time about their presence in New York and legislation being proposed in the State House. Jonathan Metzl, welcome back to 112VK.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back.
It's always fantastic to have you, even though the circumstances are not always awesome that we're speaking under.
Maybe things are changing now, so.
Let's hope. It feels like the gun control movement has gained some traction over these past several weeks post-Parkland. Since we last spoke, it seems like I'm seeing more conversations about it, I'm seeing more media about it, more interviews. The teenagers out of Parkland are really blowing my mind. What are you seeing?
Well, I agree with that very much. I mean, I think that there have been two major factors and then a couple of kind of movings of ground that we wouldn't have thought of before. I think the two major factors, first of all, is that the teenagers from Parkland have started a movement, a Never Again movement, where people are really getting involved. And I think what they've become is kind of the mouthpiece for a lot of frustration that had been brewing across the country, not just after mass shootings where people felt like the same thing kept happening again and again and nothing was done, but also about just the epidemic rates of everyday violence. And so I think what they've done is allowed people to speak out and in a way combat the learned helplessness that I think a lot of people had felt across the country. So in that sense, that's I think a huge part of the issue. And I think second, as a result, people are becoming just much more educated about firearms in society. Not to say we're going to go take away people's guns or anything, but really what kind of policies work, what's the terrain, what's the real reach of organizations like the NRA, and how can we combat that? So I think in general, there's just a lot more knowledge, and that seems to be starting to filter down into state houses and places where we never would have seen that. I mean, there's movement in places like Oregon and Washington State that I think are important, banning bump stocks, making it harder for people convicted of domestic violence to own weapons. So I think those are important loopholes. And even over the last couple of days, we've seen movement in Florida, a very, very pro-gun state, to enact some real common sense measures.
I saw a video this morning of one of their representatives talking about how kids don't get to decide what happens in Florida because kids aren't in this room and kids aren't lawmakers. And I'm like, you just inspired a lot of kids to show up to vote in the fall, but okay. Well,
and the other part of that is that really, I don't think I think the NRA is going to have to come up with some new strategies, because I think this message of we're not giving an inch on anything, it's not the compelling story. I don't think that's where people are at right now. It's really like, how can we create a world where we respect people's gun rights, but also create safer societies? And so I think they need a new playbook, to be honest.
They do need a new playbook. Let's talk about New York's playbook. There's a bill up for debate right now that would allow concealed reciprocity in the state, which basically means if you have a concealed carry license almost anywhere else in the country, that you would then be able to conceal carry in New York, even though that is not necessarily legal here. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a disaster waiting to happen, to be honest.
Right.
I think when President Trump was first elected, there was a sense among the NRA and people who were kind of supporting not gun owners, that's an important distinction, really the corporate gun lobby, that basically this was going to be an open season for all gun laws. And there was talk about overturning the Hughes Amendment, letting people own machine guns, and all these other kind of crazy things. And concealed carry reciprocity, I think, was one of the big issues that the NRA was really pushing. And the idea was basically, I'm coming from Tennessee. There are very liberal gun laws in Tennessee. I can fill up a suitcase with Glocks and AR-15s and then come to New York, and I wouldn't be subject to the gun laws of New York. I would be subject to the gun laws of Tennessee. And it seems like that's kind of a terrible idea for a number of reasons. One is, the terrifying prospect that you're going to have all these armed tourists, armed tourists at places like, New Year's Eve, Times Square with my Glock and stuff like that. But the other thing is when people come to cities like New York that have strict gun laws, guns have high illegal sale value, right? And so it also leads to the breakdown of states and cities' abilities to regulate their own gun laws. And so in that sense, I think it's just a horrible idea. But I think one encouraging thing is the concealed carry reciprocity movement actually passed a vote of Congress, and it's it's on the launch pad for the Senate. But I have to say, given the attitude of the country right now, I can't imagine that passing. I mean, it's just such an obviously terrible idea.
Right.
That, hopefully the terrain has changed, but I think it's something that's very, very important for New Yorkers and people in big cities across the country. Los Angeles, same thing. Places that have seen the success of limiting particular carry and ownership of particular guns, really to pay attention to.
Right, absolutely. And the State Assembly just passed a bill of committee that would limit, I believe, some people's ability to purchase a gun. Do you know more about that, or where that is, or how that works?
Yeah, well, I think New York's a great example, right? We have
Right.
tremendous population density. We have all kinds of different people interacting, butting up against each other.
Right.
In very, I think, lovable ways. For the most part, arguing with each other on the subway, in the softball games that I play in, or pickup basketball games,
Right.
things like that. And part of the issue is, I think New York, in the American context, is an example of what successful gun laws look like, which is that there are pathways to own firearms in New York. And it's harder to carry a gun, for example, in New York City than it is in upstate New York. And so what we've done is we've created a set of laws that make it just kind of play to our local needs. Dense urban areas, it should be harder to have a concealed weapon. You should have to have a permit. You
Right.
should be able to, look at things that people at risk. And so in that sense, I feel like it's unbelievably successful. And the new batches of legislation, I think, further that. And the basic premise of this new legislation is that imagine you're a doctor or you're a police officer. You're seeing somebody for 5 seconds who might be at risk. You don't know how threatening they were last week or last month. It really is family members, regular people who, partners, domestic partners, who can see somebody escalating. And so I think what this new legislation is saying is that there should be an avenue for family members and partners to basically alert authorities that people that they love or are close to are escalating, and that at that point there's a kind of relooking of should that person have a firearm. So it's in line with what's called a gun violence restraining order.
Right.
And I think a very important tool for a number of reasons, but one key one is that domestic abuse is a huge issue, and so it gives more power to women who are being the victims of abuse to say, take my partner's gun away. Yes.
Please take my partner's gun away in a situation like that. So how would you evaluate New York gun laws overall in terms of let's just stick to this country.
Yeah, please.
How are we doing?
Well, I think that there's really very little debate about this. That I think that regions, not just states, but regions, that as a region enact reasonable common sense gun laws, have lower rates of every kind of gun violence, lower rates of gun suicide, partner violence, shootings of police,
Now,
homicides.
when you say regions, is that why the New York City to Chicago comparison doesn't really?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's such a trick question in a certain kind of way, because New York, first of all, especially after Sandy Hook and passage of what's called the SAFE Act and other factors like that, really did I think a very bold move in terms of regulating particular kinds of firearms, particular kinds of magazines, and also importantly regulated not just long guns, not just assault rifles, but handguns, because handguns cause the most death in this country. And so New York by itself passed, I think, reasonably strict gun laws, but it's also part of a region where if you go to Connecticut, if you go to Massachusetts, other states around in the area also have relatively strict gun laws. Chicago, by comparison, it just drives me bonkers when people say, well, Chicago's an example of failed gun laws, and that's couldn't be farther from the truth. The truth is, Chicago has gun laws that are also similarly very strict, but if you're in Chicago, you have to drive, I think it's 22 minutes to go to Indiana, Wisconsin.
It's about 22 minutes.
Yeah. And so in a way, all you have to do is drive across straight lines. You can load up your car, theoretically speaking, with weapons. So in a way, Chicago can't regulate its own gun laws. It can, but it can't because it's just far too easy for people to circumvent the system. And the other issue is that there are huge loopholes in gun laws and background checks. For example, gun shows. You don't need to have a background check. It's very easy to get a weapon.
Right.
So in a way, Chicago shows why it's gun violence prevention is a regional issue in addition to being a state issue.
Absolutely. And, you know, people have been discussing a lot of different ways to fix this, right? They're talking about banning bump stocks. They're talking about arming teachers. They're talking about, you know, banning assault rifles, raising the age that you have to be. Are these things going to be helpful? Or, I mean, I'm guessing some of them can be or will be, but other ones I am not super encouraged by, especially arming teachers. What are you, like, where are you on those?
Well, I'm kind of predictable about this. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say on one hand, I can understand the emotional response, particularly of banning assault rifles, because assault rifles are causing all of this death and mass shootings, and they're very important symbols of our own powerlessness. And so in that sense, I think banning assault rifles, I can understand why it has the symbolic valence that it does. And I think that's important. Banning teachers, I think, is
Arming teachers.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Don't ban them.
Yeah, let's ban teachers.
We need 'em.
If we ban teachers, then we'd not have armed teachers. No, I would say that I just think that arming teachers brings more guns into schools, and so even though that might make some emotional sense, all you're doing is adding the so-called environmental hazard, the gun. You're just putting more guns in schools. So for me, there's no evidence that that's going to work. And it's not surprising to me why the NRA and President Trump and other people are pushing this. I think that what it does is it just creates the market for more guns, right? And so in a way, I think that's beneath a lot of this. And it creates an emotional sense that schools are embattled zones, when really I think what you need to be doing is making the opposite case, that schools are safer, more accepting. And so in that sense, I think that it's a really bad idea to arm teachers. Now, I do think there are things on the docket right now that are important and will make a difference. One is this idea of a waiting period, a 3-day waiting period for gun sales. That's one of the things that's that's being proposed in Florida. And the reason that's important is because so much gun violence, and particularly gun suicide, is incredibly impulsive, right? Somebody finds out that somebody's having an affair, they got fired, they just want to rush off and get a gun and do something horrible, or they're in a conflict, they want to run. So having a kind of cooling off period, this is not a new idea, and it's something that it used to have Republican support. President Reagan used to support a 3-day period and things like that. And so in that sense, I think a waiting period is a fantastic idea, and will kind of stem this tide of impulsive gun violence. I also think that background checks, if we can kind of nationalize the background check policy, what you're doing is you're identifying high-risk people and communities, and so it creates, again, if we can make it much more efficient and close some of the loopholes, I think that the literature on background checks really has shown that states that enact effective background check measures see about a 50% drop in pretty much all kinds of gun violence, including suicides, including shootings of police officers. And so I think people should get around this because, again, this is something we do for automobiles and other things that are regulated.
We do. I'm sorry we ran out of time for this conversation in the broadcast, but if you want to hear more about the NRA and more of Jonathan's thoughts on gun laws, just tune in to the podcast.